for the simple reason that I want to address a couple of things to do with Much Ado About Nothing that take it beyond the basic level, if you like, of IGCSE work. I'm making various assumptions, therefore, as I talk. One, that anybody listening to this screencast is familiar with the plot, and that therefore has an understanding of the characters at the centre of the play, their relationships, how their characters actually are controlled and sorted, if you like, into groups, understanding the basic themes of the play, and probably above all an open mind which has taken on the basic knowledge required to be able to write about this play at GCSE level, and is perhaps looking to assimilate some ideas on top of that level. So the first thing I want to actually look at is the genre of the play and the effect of that genre. And I have covered this somewhere else on the blog and in a different screencast, but this is today a slightly different take on it. I want to place the play in the context of its literary heritage. In other words, this is a comedy. And since the 4th century BC in Athens, comedy has begun to centre around a love story and the struggles of the lovers to achieve a happy ending. Old comedy in Greece, the comedy of people of Aristophanes, for example, in the 5th century, was a much more satirical form of comedy. The comedy of new comedy, writers like Menander, which led into the Roman comedy of Terence and Plautus, is much more this well, essentially rather sitcom-esque idea of a pair who suffer a tragic misunderstanding somewhere, which leads to the heroine being wronged, and everything does come out all right after vital and discovered. Often the heroine will have had to have been put away out of sight for a while in order for this to happen. And the plot therefore turns on an element, if you like, of recognition of right and wrong, and it's based always on a resolution of the conflict. And I think in this idea of the recognition of the error is a clear link to one of the key ideas of Much Ado About Nothing, that is to say, noting as a theme, and this idea of the ability of characters to note to greater or lesser degrees, causing not only the comedy to be established, but also, of course, the resolution. And this might be a good moment for you, even at this stage, if you're listening to this, just to go to your scripts and begin to have a look, begin to flick through and see if you can notice for yourselves these moments of recognition that are happening in the play. This is both misnoting and noting. And pause the screencast whilst you're doing that. When we come back, we look then at the idea of mistaken identity. Very often comedies have this idea of mistaken identity, and again in Much Ado, this is a strand that can be explored quite easily. Again, misnoting, not only in the crux of the play, the inability of Claudio to discern the fact that Margaret, whilst making love to Borachio, is not his fiancée, but also tricks that by the 16th century, 17th century, 16th century, were very, very common. This is a play written in 1599, of course. Masked balls. Moments where on the stage we perhaps share the illusion as an audience of a loss of identity. Now, Shakespeare wrote around 16 comedies. He took conventions to the limit, I would say, for the time. And in this play, he introduces a wonderful amount of complexity. He's not content with a single pair of lovers in order to chart the course of this route to marriage, but he introduces another pair. One pair seem to meet for the first time either immediately before Act 1, Scene 1, before the Pedro army went off to war, but meet properly in Act 1, Scene 1. The other pair know each other of old, and Shakespeare establishes a clear level of distrust and quite active dislike between the two. From the moment Beatrice opens her mouth on stage when she engages in a skirmish of wit with the messenger. Her aim is to belittle Benedick. Hero and Claudio, though, are the pair that perhaps are most interesting from the perspective of a straightforward comedy. Unusually, if you like, or as a change to the established plot, there's no obstacle to their marriage from either the father or a patron or a governor type figure. What we actually have here is something new, something that wouldn't appear in the Roman comedy. This is an active dark side in the form of Don John. He seems to want to ruin this wedding simply for sport. Now, there's a wonderful book called The Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker. It's a big book. If you're one of my students listening to this, there's a copy in the library because I've had it put there. There's also a copy that you can borrow if you ask me very nicely in the English department. And it's an interesting book. It's a lovely book because it charts this idea that there are actually only 7 basic plots, and the idea of the dark and the light is something that Booker writes very well about. And I'd like to just sort of get you thinking in this sort of way. You know, you have Darth Vader as your ultimate darkness character. Now, if John really is a prototype Vader, then there has to be a sense that he's sort of controlling Claudio, if you like, what I've called a puppet master. It's something that I think Shakespeare does quite often with his baddies and brings into probably best light in the play Othello in the character of Iago. And if John is controlling Claudio and pulling his strings, then we need to see Claudio, as obviously at the beginning of the play, a representative, if you like, of light, becoming jealous, uncaring, selfish, self-righteous, and moving across to the dark side. And if we see that, then we can begin to agree with this idea that there is a definite shift. Now, it's fairly obvious, I think, and I'll give you some time in a minute, or you can just pause in a moment yourselves, to work out where it is after the show that he becomes a dark character. And you can find evidence for jealousy, cruelty and self-righteousness from the very end of Act 3, Scene 2. I would say that Act 4, Scene 1 and the opening of 5-1 are especially good ground for looking for this. And here's a point to note well yourselves. If you are writing a character essay, all character essays should try to develop the idea of how characters change, grow, develop, take on new characteristics during a play or a novel, and beginning to identify the key points at which this happens as part of your essay. This is what the examiners will be looking for. They're not just looking for you to list the things that a character does. This is very important, and I hope you take it on board. So Claudio, having gone to the bad side, of course, needs to learn a lesson and be brought back into the right. And again, having traced his descent into darkness in Act 4, we need to spot where this begins to happen in Act 5. Certainly, he's probably at his most arrogant and selfish in his conversation with Leonato and Antonio. His disdainful dismissal of these aggrieved old men challenging him, and then his attempts to laugh about it with Benedick. But we notice that as soon as Borachio is brought on stage, Claudio snaps back. He is a character often we discuss, I think, in class, the speed of Claudio's emotional response to anything. He's a character given to very, very quick emotional reaction. And you should probably see here then very clearly the moment that he returns to the light and has to atone for what he has done to Hero, or at least what everybody, well, yes, what he has done to Hero. She may not be dead, but he has killed her socially, just as much as if she were dead. In Hero, we have an innocent, naive girl. Modest is how she describes her actions that she will perform, and it's a word that it carries a weight in the 16th century for everything that a woman should be: demure, quiet, supportive of their husband, and so on. Here, Claudio is tricked. As a result of that, Hero is attacked. She has to hide, whilst darkness is in the ascendancy, but can return once light is restored. And Shakespeare plays with us, but also respects custom in terms of this, by ensuring that here the characters of the three girls that are there as the choice are hidden. The masked ball in Act 2 is balanced by the masked or veiled ceremony in Act 5. Once order is restored, a happy ending can follow, and the two are reunited and recognise their love for each other, with this idea of Claudio, another hero. Nothing certain, one hero died defiled, but I do live, and surely as I live, I am a maid, she says. This dignity that seems to go throughout Hero's role, particularly when she's talking to men. It's worth noticing that the only times that she is portrayed in a female environment, she is quite different. She's rather assertive, no stranger to a double entendre in the middle of Act 3 when she's trying on her wedding dress. But here again, her quiet dignity as she gets her salvation, if you like, in the form of marriage is impressive, and we note it. So that's basic comedy, if you like. A couple, disunited, reunited, married. Now, rather than talking about Beatrice and Benedick at this point, we talk about them a lot. I wanted to bring another convention of comedy out here, and that's the idea that the high are generally brought down by the low. And so whilst we have this group of the Guard, Dogberry, Verges and the Guard, and they are tiresome comic, Elizabethan puns don't translate well into a modern audience, and I'm not sure that they would have actually translated terribly well at the time to the groundlings, the cheap seats, or the cheap standings rather. They're well served by the amount of dirty jokes and double entendre in this play. And I think that actually, if you're without any education, then a lot of Dogberry's malapropisms will possibly pass you by. And I think it's worth not being too quick to make the point that he is only playing for the uneducated. I think there's much more to Dogberry than that. There should, in any decent comedy, be a clash of status and a sense that the world is turned on its head. Now, whether this is, if you like, typically in Roman comedy, the new generation with the old generation, or whether it's a social status thing, which I think we see in this play to a degree, as alongside the generational comedy. We need to see how this might be developed in writing. Certainly, Don John's plot is designed to get at Dom Pedro's sense of honour, and Claudio, driven by his rather perverse sense of honour, humiliates Hero, whose honour is defiled. This knot is actually undone, not by Beatrice, for example, who's clever, or by any of the upper class intelligentsia, but by the stupid Guard and Dogberry. Dogberry, therefore, is a very useful structural device. He uncovers the plot. He serves a dramatic purpose in that his malapropisms mean that he can't clearly inform Leonato of the crisis at the end of Act 3, and thus enables Act 4 to take place. The revelation will eventually take place, but after the crisis. Because of Dogberry's scenes with Borachio and Conrad, there's a wonderful sense of dramatic irony. The audience know, at the beginning of Act 4, Scene 1, that everything has actually been uncovered. It's just that Leonato and the main players don't know it. Thus, Dogberry prolongs the time taken to reach the denouement of the play, and the comic effect, therefore, is heightened all the time. But I want to just add a little bit more now about something that is slightly more than GCSE. Critical theory is not something that is looked at in the GCSE syllabus in any board. It's very much part of A-level work, but there's no reason at all why we shouldn't just consider Dogberry, given that we're expanding and going beyond, in the light of one particular critical theory, that of Marxist theory. And I've prepared on the next slide, after this short digression, a handout which sadly has not gone across to this slide. The handout is available in the lecture hall where I'm giving this talk. So what I'll do is go through it. If we follow Marxist theory, then what Marxist theoreticians believe is that any play or novel or work of art has both an overt meaning and a covert meaning. The overt meaning, what is open and easily seen, in this case is a love story, a rom-com. The covert meaning, though, is the hidden layer. This is the layer beneath, the subtext, if you like. And I think the covert meaning of a play like Much Ado, presumably, is the idea of a rather complacent bourgeoisie, this idea of this very complacent, wealthy, leisured society who seem to have nothing to do whatsoever, apart from either march off and fight wars, or wait for people to have done so. There's no sense of anybody in the upper classes of this play working at any point. And yet they are embarrassed by a stupid working class man, and the result is a shift of power away from the absolute elite to a degree. Not only that, but a Marxist would also begin to look at how the status of the writer implies messages in his play. Now, Shakespeare here is not of high birth, and perhaps because of that is seeking to imply a need for equality in the drama. Thus, again, Dogberry is the hinge for the class struggle. Shakespeare was at court, but he was an employee. He had an interesting position. The longer he stayed as a court playwright and was increasingly involved in life at court, the more he would have had a chance to see the top echelons of Elizabeth's court at this time and begin to perceive how hypocritical, shallow, untrustworthy they were. Part of the whole point of comedy is that comedy is a genre that requires equality. It's not a grandiose, puffed up, aristocratic genre such as tragedy. Not only that, but again, we've got here a sense of equality in how much of this play is actually written in prose rather than verse. Ultimately, as this goes on, we begin to have a situation where a theatre audience becomes increasingly democratic. It's a place in which rich and poor rub shoulders. It's a chance to comment on the strata of society, which are actually completely visible within the theatre, rather like some gigantic layer cake at the Globe with the groundlings at the bottom going up to the increasingly wealthy aristocracy at the top, an aristocracy who are slumming it for the evening by crossing the river to Southwark and risking, quite apart from robbery or anything else, a wetting in the Thames in their boat, and have come to Southwark, outside the city of London, where they are attending a play in an area which is proliferated by brothels, bear-baiting pits, and genuine low life. And it's a chance really to engage with this in terms of this comedy, which might interest a Marxist commentator. Finally, on metre, the rich generally deliver poetry in high form. The lower classes always speak in prose or fragmented language. And it's in this play the lower classes who often make the most sense. Now, with this play, there is a slight difference to this message. Poetry in this play is generally reserved for high emotion, for love. Benedick, for example, very, very rarely speaks in poetry, neither does Beatrice. They're both of the upper class, but they are slightly different, aren't they? They challenge, they push the boundaries of what is acceptable all the time. Maybe there is more to this idea than it's just for love. Maybe this is a message to do with how some of the higher classes can be trusted, but the absolute elite, the Pedros of this world and the sycophantic Leonatos of this world, have a lesson to learn, and Mr. Shakespeare is the man to teach them that lesson. through his character Dogberry. And before we all start thinking of Dogberry as some weird proto-Lenin, he isn't. But what he does do is that he shows at a lower level than the main plot illustrations of what we are seeing. Just as Pedro will lead his followers into the game of playing with people's emotions that is so disastrous, Dogberry sees himself as a leader of men. It's fairly obvious in what little he says that Verges is probably a more able sidekick than Dogberry. He certainly seems to be able to speak in sense, which means he has to be left behind. And in that lovely riding metaphor of the two men on the horse, one must ride behind, that Dogberry uses, he's always being shunted to the back as the, well, arrogant Dogberry who refuses to take advice, who needs assistance from all others but is very, very reluctant ever to admit it, who gives orders which make no sense whatsoever to the watch, who requires Verges and the sexton to intercede for him at times in order that he be successful, and yet who is hurt beyond measure when he's called an ass. The leader is a bit of an ass. This two-level comedy, I think, works very nicely. The marriage comedy is a game invented by Don Pedro to pass the time. He's no idea and no interest in how catastrophic it might turn out to be. He has no interest in people's emotions other than his own. He doesn't seem to care. Society seems to be his playthings. He can't see his brother's deceit. And at the end of the play, he's left isolated and unloved. Even Leonato has turned on him. Leonato, who has been so sycophantic for most of the play, turns on him in Act 5, Scene 1. And Shakespeare gives us this sense of the very highest of society being brought down a peg, not destroyed. We're not advocating here a complete revolution. But what we are looking at is the sense that the highest in society need to be taught a lesson. Dogberry, in his below stairs parallels, has much the same issue as Pedro. He doesn't seem to be interested in anybody giving him advice, and ends up issuing wildly contradictory instructions. It's not he that catches the malefactors, actually it's the watch. He takes command immediately and ignores everybody who might help. He's obsessed with honour, albeit his honour is not a great thing, even to the same extent that Leonato and Pedro seem to be. He did call me ass. This hurts him. It keeps on being repeated that he has been called an ass by Conrad. He has little intrinsic honour in the sense of Pedro or Leonato, but something has hurt his pride. And so it just seems to me that he's a sort of smaller mirror of the world above stairs, a world in which the nobles are arrogant mischief makers. And then we wonder whether they also lack real honour, true honour, in terms of what they think of as honour, being their good name, which seems to be founded on very, very little at all. There is such a simple plot to this play. A couple vow to marry, a dark character plants a seed of jealousy, a comic fool discovers the plot, and all is revealed. It's a very, very straightforward play. It has, however, this wonderful level of complexity. Shakespeare can use Dogberry to ensure that nothing happens quite as quickly as it might. He has a dark character who's not a terribly well-written dark character, and to him he adds two others, Borachio and Conrad, to flesh out and give more interest to this dark character. In a later play, one might imagine that John might contain elements of these two characters in himself, rather than be, as he is, quite such a cipher alongside them. We find Shakespeare here stressing the social climbing of the world of the play through Leonato, and again, you should probably look for evidence of this, but Leonato is a tier below Pedro. And this is the foundation for his wish to be welcoming and to let Pedro into the world. And he introduces a subplot that introduces two of the finest characters in any of his plays, in Beatrice and Benedick. Memory of any good performance of this play will have Beatrice and Benedick in our minds long after any of the others have shifted. It's an imbalance which caused most of the treatments of the play since its writing to often be renamed Beatrice and Benedick, rather than either Much Ado About Nothing or reference to Claudio and Hero. In fact, at times Claudio and Hero are removed altogether in terms of retreatments of the play because they are not actually terribly interesting. But what they are is the leftover comic protagonists of an older form of comedy. And that is very important. So that when you're writing about the play, never write them off. Take the opportunity to stress their position as the pair at the centre of the comic plot, the standard comedy plot, requiring a couple to split and rejoin. A heroine who is innocent and who is wronged and who comes back. In this case, there's a dark force that causes it. And there should be, and there is in this play in spades, a clash between the upper and the lower classes, in which the upper classes, whilst not defeated, that would be far too strong, actually learn something from the lower classes. Now, with that in mind, I hope you have every success in your exams as they come up, and I hope that this has helped you just open your eyes to some of the wider ways that you can begin to look at this great play. Thanks for listening.